Remember, she is Dornish. In the Reach, men said it was the food that made the Dornishmen so hot-tempered, and their women so wild and wanton. Fiery peppers and strange spices heat the blood. She cannot help herself. The Thoughts of Aris Oakhart. Feast for Crows, Chapter 13. The Soiled Knight. Archmaester Brood, who was born and raised in the Shadow City that huddles beneath the crumbling walls of Sunspear, once observed that Dorne has more in common with the distant north and the Iron Islands than it does with the realms that lie between them. One is hot, the other's cold, yet these ancient kingdoms of sand and snow and sea are set apart from the rest of Westeros by history, culture and tradition. They cling stubbornly to their own laws and traditions. None of them were ever truly conquered by the dragons of House Targaryen. Harrenhal was effectively a river king, while the king in the north accepted Aegon Targaryen as overlord peacefully, whilst Dorne resisted the might of House Targaryen valiantly for almost 200 years, before finally submitting to the Iron Throne through marriage. Dornishmen, the Ironborn and Northmen alike, are derided as savages by the ignorance of the so-called 5 civilized kingdoms, and celebrated for their valour by those who have crossed swords with them in battle. For the most part at least, the Dornish proudly like to boast that theirs is the oldest of the 7 kingdoms. In some regards this is true, but it's stretching the reality of history somewhat. Unlike the Andals who came later, the first men were not seafarers and had little in the way of technology. They came to Westeros not on longships, but afoot, over the land bridge from Essos, the remnants of which exist today only as stepstones and the broken arm of Dorne. Walking and riding the eastern shores of Dorne would inevitably have been where they first set foot upon Westerosi soil. In this respect, you can argue they are the oldest of the kingdoms of Westeros. Garth liked to plant his seed in fertile ground, they say. I should wonder that more than his hands were green, Olenna red wine. To Sansa Stark, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 6, Sansa 1. As you would of course expect given their lack of technology, few of the first men chose to remain in Dorne, for the land they encountered was far from welcoming. The children of the forest who inhabited Westeros before the coming of the first men called Dorne the Empty Land, and for good reason. The eastern half of Dorne is mostly made up of barren scrub, its dry, stony soil yielding little, even when irrigated by later more advanced settlers, and once beyond Vaith, western Dorne is nothing but an endless vast sea of flowing sand dunes, where the sun beats down relentlessly and without mercy, giving rise from time to time to savage sandstorms that can strip the flesh from a man's bones within minutes. Even Garth Greenhand, the legendary First Men King, could not make flowers bloom in the environment so harsh and unforgiving as Dorne, if the tales told in the Reach can be believed. But some have suggested, given the enmity between Dorne and the Reach, this tale was always meant to belittle the Dornish, and Dorne's own legends make no mention of Garth at all. Instead they claimed he led his people through the mountains to the fertile Reach beyond, which is where the legend of him being able to make flowers bloom comes from, with it being metaphorical, meaning he led his people through Dorne to a land where flowers bloomed. Most of the first men who came after him took one look at Dorne and followed, yet not all. Some there were who stayed and saw the beauty in this stark, hot, cruel land, and chose to make their homes there. Most of them settled along the banks of the river they named the Greenblood, though meagre when compared to the likes of the Mander, the Trident, or the Blackwater Rush. The waters of the Greenblood are truly the lifeblood of Dorne. Most first men who chose to remain in Dorne, the determined few that is, instead of wandering north in search of sweeter lands, settled close to the banks of the Greenblood and other smaller rivers across the whole of the kingdom, digging canals and deep ditches to bring life-giving water to the trees and crops they planted. While this method of irrigation and farming was nowhere near as close as effective as the kingdoms to the north, it did work, and allowed the first men to call Dorne their home. Others preferred to dwell beside the narrow sea, with the eastern shorelines of Dorne more forgiving than the southern, due to the way in which the winds blow and the weather patterns favour. Soon, many small villages arose, sustaining themselves on fish and crabs from the narrow sea. Some of the first men settlers were even bolder than those who stayed close to the riverbanks or coastlines. The more relentless of the first men pushed onwards and made homes for themselves in the foothills of the Red Mountains. What they discovered were the storms moving north were on occasion dropping their moisture, creating a fertile green belt in the desolate land. Those who climbed farther took refuge among the peaks, in hidden valleys and high mountain meadows, where grass was green and sweet. Only the bravest and maddest dared to strike out inland across the deep sands. A few of these did find water amongst the dunes, and raised holdfasts and castles on those oases. Their descendants, centuries later, became the lords of the wells. But for every man who stumbled upon a well, 100 must surely have died of thirst beneath the blazing Dornish sun. Dornishmen are notoriously stubborn, Your Grace. Prince Quinton's forebearers fought your own for the better part of 200 years. Barristan Selmy to Daenerys Targaryen, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 50, Daenerys 8. It quickly became clear that the first men who settled Dorne had split themselves into 3 distinct groups of people, each with their own culture and way of life, but all still distinctly Dornish. So much so, these 3 distinct types of Dornishmen we know today trace their roots back to these original settlers. While the Dornish have their own names for each of these groups, King Daeron I Targaryen, the Young Dragon, gave them the names that they are known by today in a book he penned called The Conquest of Dorne. Stony Dornishmen, Sandy Dornishmen, and Salty Dornishmen he named them. The Stony Dornishmen were the mountain folk, fair of hair and skin, mostly descended from the first men and the Andals. The Sandy Dornishmen dwelled in the deserts and river valleys, with their skin burned brown beneath the blazing Dornish sun. The Salty Dornishmen of the coasts were dark-haired, with olive skin, and have the queerest customs and the most Rhoynish blood. When Princess Nymeria came ashore in Dorne, most of the Rhoynar preferred to remain close to the sea that had been their home for so long, even after Nymeria had burnt their ships. By the modern era, in Dorne, descent from the Rhoynar is strongest amongst the 3 people groups in the Salty Dornish, and they left their mark across the whole kingdom. The Rhoynar were a slender people with smooth olive skin, black hair and dark eyes. The impact on the Dornish gene pool is strongest along the coast with the Salty Dornish, and grows fainter further inland. It's also believed that Dornishmen with more Andal and First Men blood are larger and fairer than those with more Rhoynish blood. Dornish culture has First Men and Andal origin, but much of the elements have been lost over time and is now strongly influenced by the mass immigration of the Rhoynar, who settled Dorne during the Rhoynar migration. Their influence can be observed in the many Dornish customs that are distinctly different from the rest of Westeros, including the likes of the laws of inheritance. In Dorne, unlike the other 6 kingdoms, no distinction is made between sons and daughters. Instead, children inherit in order of birth regardless of gender, as per Rhoynish custom. In the case of an inheriting female, her last name will be passed on to her children, instead of the name of her husband. Furthermore, views on bastardy are much milder in Dorne compared to the rest of Westeros, especially when a child is born to a paramour. The Dornish are not greatly concerned if a child is born in wedlock or out of it. Many lords and some ladies in Dorne have paramours, and homosexuality is more accepted. Typically, like most of Westeros, the Dornish follow the faith of the Seven. However, we know there are several temples of R'hllor located in Dorne, with a small number following the Red God. The Dornish speak in the common tongue, as does the rest of the 7 kingdoms, but unlike in the other kingdoms, their speech is marked by the influence of the language of the Rhoynar. This influence can be found all over Dorne, but most strongly among the Salty Dornish, who, as we've said, have the most Rhoynish blood. They speak with a Dornish drawl, stretching, rolling, and littering some words. Some describe the Dornish speech as charming, while others, such as the Marcher Lords, often claim they find the Dornish accent impossible to understand. The Dornish climate favours loose layered robes. Dornish nobles tend to wear robes of linen, satin, silk, or samite, accessorized with jeweled belts. Dornish armour is heavily enamelled and inlaid with burnished copper, shining silver and soft red gold, with cloaks over it to keep the sun off. Similarly, it is Dornish fashion to wrap helmets in a long scarf, to prevent the sun from beating down upon it and heating up the helmets and burning the skull below when crossing the deserts of Dorne during daytime. Veils are also used to keep sand out of faces. but even these are useless against the worst of the sandstorms and heat. Dornish prefer spicy food, particularly snake sauce, with a drop of venom in it, as well as mustard seeds and dragon peppers. They produce their own wines, often known as Dornish Reds. They are generally sour, though they occasionally can be more rich in taste. Strong wines from Dorne are as dark as blood, with a sweet taste, and are valued across the world into the deepest parts of Essos.